So in my best cases of 2024, I asked you guys if you thought I'd missed a particular case, let me know. And judging by the comments section, I had missed something, and it was the Antec Flux Pro. So I am a man of my word. I'm here today to make a full step-by-step build guide in this case for you. If you see any parts you like, you'll find links to all the parts in the description. So by popular request, let's dive in and take a detailed look at this case. To remove our case's tempered glass side panel, there's a little notch at the back you can get your fingers into, then pull it out from the back and lift up and away. And our other side panel is removed in exactly the same way. If we take a look at the back of this panel, you'll notice we've got this perforated area down at the bottom, and this is to act as a source of intake for fans mounted on the power supply shroud. There's no additional dust filters over this, although the holes in the mesh are nice and fine. Taking a look at our case's top I/O, we've got a power and reset button, a combined headphone and microphone jack, we've got two USB Type A ports, a single Type C port, and we've got a button labelled temp, and this changes what's displayed on the screen on the side of our case. To remove our case's top panel, there's a notch at the back you can get your fingers into and simply pop it off. And again, if we take a look at the back of this panel, you'll notice there's no additional dust filters. We've got a removable fan stroke radiator bracket at the top of the case, and on this you're going to be able to mount up to 3 140mm fans or up to a 420mm radiator, and we do have 120mm fan and radiator mounting slots if you prefer. This bracket's held on with a screw at each side, and then with the screws removed we can simply tilt this panel up and lift away. Taking a look at our front panel, you can see we've got mesh in the middle with walnut round the outside. To remove this panel, it's simply a matter of getting your fingers underneath and then pulling it out from the bottom and pulling down. Again, there's no additional dust filters, and Antec are going with just mesh at the front. So with the front panel removed, you can see that Antec have installed 3 140mm PWM non-RGB fans at the front of the case. If you prefer, it is possible to mount up to a 420mm radiator at the front, and again, if you want to go with 120mm fans or radiators in multiple of 120, it is possible to mount them here as well. So our front fans are connected to a fan stroke radiator bracket, and this bracket can be installed in 5 different height positions. So you can see we've got our bracket installed in the 3rd position. We've got 2 holes above and 2 holes below. So to adjust the bracket's position, there's 3 screws on each side that we're going to need to remove. So as we mentioned, out of the box, the bracket is installed in the middle 3rd position. So above this bracket, we've got 40mm of space. So you're going with a 360mm radiator at the top. It's not going to interfere with this bracket. If you want to go with a 420mm radiator at the top, you're going to need to move this down to the 4th position. This is going to move the bracket down 15mm, so we've now got 55mm of space above the bracket, so you should be able to fit a standard 420mm AIO at the top. If you do want to go with a really thick radiator at the top, it is possible to move the bracket down a further position. So we've moved the bracket right down to the bottom. Again, we've added another 50mm of clearance at the top, so you've now got up to 70mm of clearance above the bracket for a thick 420mm radiator at the top. So I'm planning on installing a 360mm radiator at the top, so I'm going to leave the bracket in the default 3rd position. You can see at the rear of the case, Antec have installed another 140mm PWM non-ARGB fan. Although if you prefer, it is possible to mount either a 120mm fan or radiator, and you can go as large as a 140mm radiator at the rear. It's also possible to mount fans on our power supply shroud, and you can see that Antec have installed 2 120mm PWM non-ARGB reverse blade fans. So these are going to be set to intake, drawing cool air in through the mesh on both sides of the case and up and into your graphics card. If you want to, it is possible to add an additional 120mm fan beside these 2 fans. The little bracket at the bottom is held on with 2 screws, and then I'm just going to push my hand in from underneath to push this bracket up, and we're then going to simply be able to lift it out. And you can see now we've got 120mm holes for securing a fan. If you'd rather not have any fans on the power supply shroud, Antec do include a further 2 of these plates, so you can simply remove the 2 fans that are there and replace these plates at the bottom. Alternatively, it is possible to mount up to a 360mm radiator on the power supply shroud. You might wonder how you're going to screw that in from underneath, but actually these fans are installed on a removable bracket. So there's 2 screws we need to loosen, and then we're simply going to be able to tilt the bracket up and remove it from the case. Now obviously these fans are managed, and I'm planning to leave them at the bottom, so I'm not going to fully remove them. So you can see on this side of the case below our tempered glass panel, we've got this mesh panel, which again is going to act as a good source of inflow for the fans mounted on our power supply shroud. This is the screen I was talking about earlier on, and on this you're going to be able to display your CPU and GPU temperatures. And you're going to be able to do this by plugging the USB 2.0 cable into your motherboard and using Antec's iUnity software. And I'll show you this at the end of the build. So this panel is also removable. All you need to do is simply lift it up and then it can be removed from the case. In terms of motherboard support, the case supports motherboards up to ATX, but you'll see we don't have any additional cutouts for back connector motherboards. If you do want to go with a CPR cutter, the maximum height supported is up to 190mm. Taking a look at the rear of the case, you can see we've got 8 horizontal PCI expansion slot brackets, and in terms of graphics card support, it's absolutely massive, up to a maximum length of 455mm. And on the bottom of the case, we've got a full-length dust filter which can simply be pulled out from the front. Taking a look at the other side of the case, it's good to see we've got large rubber grommets over towards the right-hand side of the motherboard and below the motherboard. We've got the central cable raceway with Velcro cable straps here, and we've also got Velcro cable straps here to manage our EPS cables. At the front of the case, we've got a 5-port PWM and ARGB hub, and you can see that 5 of our included case fans have already been plugged into the hub. The only slightly disappointing thing is that Antec have included 6 case fans with this case, and there's nowhere to plug our rear case fan. So our hub is going to have motherboard control. All we're going to need to do is plug the ARGB cable and the PWM cable coming from the hub into headers on our motherboard and power the hub by plugging a SATA cable from our power supply into the SATA cable. Beneath our PWM and ARGB hub, we've got 2 drive trays. To remove them, there's a captive thumb screw at the top that you're going to need to remove. And then once this has been loosened, you simply need to lift the bracket up to remove it from the case. So on this bracket, you're going to be able to install either a 2.5-inch or 3.5-inch drive. You can see the hole mounts we've got for a 2.5-inch drive, so you're going to set the 2.5-inch drive in the back and simply screw it in from the front. If you're going with a 3.5-inch drive, set it into the drive cage and then secure it into place with 2 screws at each side. Behind our motherboard, we've got 2 dedicated 2.5-inch drive mounting brackets. Again, there's a captive thumb screw at the top holding them in place, and then we can lift the bracket up to remove it. Again, in terms of securing drives on these, you're going to set your 2.5-inch drive into place and again secure it with 4 screws at the back. We've got another hard drive cage at the bottom of the case. To remove it, there's a captive thumb screw we can loosen, and then we can pull the drive cage towards us and lift it up to remove it. So we take a look at this drive cage. There is a drive tray in it. We just simply pull it here to remove it. And in this drive tray, you're going to be able to mount either a 3.5-inch or 2.5-inch drive. On top of the drive tray itself, we've got a separate 2.5-inch drive mounting bracket. And on this, we're going to be able to set our 2.5-inch drive and screw it in from the back. If you prefer, it is possible to set a 3.5-inch drive directly on top of the hard drive cage. And I'll take a look in from underneath. You notice we've got these large slits at the top and at the bottom. So you're going to be able to get a screwdriver in and screw the drive in from underneath. So it is possible to adjust the position of the hard drive cage. If we take a look in from the bottom, you'll notice that this little bracket is held in with 4 screws. So if we loosen the screws, you'll notice that the bracket is now mobile, so you can slide it into the position that you want, and then you would just simply need to re-secure it with the screws. Alternatively, you can remove the hard drive bracket altogether, and you'll see that this is then going to give you the option to mount fans at the bottom of the case, and it is possible to mount either 2 120 or 2 140mm fans, or up to a 240mm radiator at the bottom. If we take a look at the bottom, you'll notice we've got a cable extension to power our power supply, and this goes to this little connector at the back of the case. The reason for this is Antec wants you to install your power supply sideways, so it's going to give you better access to plugging the cables in after the build. And in this particular orientation, you're going to be able to install your power supply up to a maximum length of 180mm, not including the cables. And if we take a look in from the other side, you're going to use the power supply screws to secure your power supply using these 4 holes. And we've got an initial cutout here to get a screwdriver through. So how you're going to bring the cable extension to the back of the power supply depends on whether your connector comes out towards the back or towards the front of the case. And obviously you're going to install your power supply with the fan facing down the way. So with the connector towards the back of the case, you're just going to route the cable out this connector behind the power supply. So we'll temporarily set this forward. So you notice if we install the cable just as it is, we're going to struggle in terms of pressure because this flat bit of the cable isn't flexible. So what we're going to want to do is bring the cable through the cutout. We're then going to twist it down and bring the bracket all the way round into a loop and plug it into our power supply. And then we can go ahead and slide the power supply back into place. So when our mesh panel goes back into place, it is going to hide this loop. So if your connector is this side of the power supply, but it's actually turned upside down, then when you plug this cable in, the connector is going to be coming out this end anyway. So it's just a simple matter of plugging it in, and you're going to have this little bit of loop at the bottom. If you've got your power supply with the connector towards the front, you're obviously going to bring the cable in through this cutout here. So you want to route the cable over the top of the power supply, And then if we set this forward slightly, we're going to be able to bring the cable in. So again, whether you're going to need to make a loop with the cable depends on the orientation of the connector. With this particular cable, we're going to be able to plug it straight in, and that's going to look nice and tidy. If the connector was upside down, all we'd need to do is have a little bit of a loop at the bottom, and that would allow us to get our connector plugged in. If you're not interested in changing the orientation of your power supply, you're going to be able to install it in the standard orientation. You simply need to remove this panel at the back and the connecting cable. And in the case accessory box, you get this bracket. You're going to simply fix it to the back of your power supply and then slide the whole thing in from the back, securing it with the 2 thumb screws. And with your power supply installed in the standard orientation and the hard drive cage installed all the way towards the back of the case, the maximum length of power supplies is up to 180mm, including the cables. If you do slide the hard drive cage all the way to the front, you've now got up to 300mm of space for your power supply, including the cables. And with the hard drive cage removed altogether, you got 470mm of space for your power supply. Last thing I want to show you is a very nice case accessory box that we have. So you can see all our screws are individually packaged and you're going to be able to store them in this box when you're finished. We're now ready to start working on our motherboard, and we're going to be installing our CPU, the bracket for our CPU cooler, our M.2 SSD and our RAM before we put the motherboard into the case. To open our socket cover, we need to push this lever down and out to bring it all the way to the middle of the motherboard, and then we're going to be able to open the socket cover up. We can then lower our CPU down into the socket, taking care to hold it by the edges and make sure we've got the text the correct way up. Once we're happy the CPU is sitting correctly in the socket, we can go ahead and close the cover back down again. Then as we close the lever, the black bit of plastic will pop off and we'll put it in our motherboard box for safekeeping. To install the brackets for our CPU cooler, we're going to need to remove our stock clips, they're each held on with 2 screws. And then we've got one of the AMD standoffs that comes with our cooler to screw onto each corner. I'm going to install our M.2 SSD in the top slot, so there's a little lever on the left hand side of the heatsink we just need to push in, and then we're going to be able to tilt the heatsink up and lift away. We're going to need to remove the plastic protection. We can then insert our M.2 SSD into the slot, and all we need to do is flatten it down to secure it. And we can then replace the heatsink. We're going to be installing our RAM in the 2nd and 4th slot along from the CPU, so I'm going to go ahead and open the clips on these slots. Then all we need to do is line the RAM up with the slot, and once we're happy everything's lined up, it's some firm pressure, and the RAM is going to clip into place. And then it's just the same thing with our 2nd stick. Next we can set the motherboard into the case, line it up with the standoffs at the back, and you'll notice that once the middle standoff goes through the middle hole, it's going to help hold the motherboard in place. We can then secure the motherboard to the case using 9 of the screws with a little lip around the outside. Our HD audio cable is going to go into this header down the bottom left hand side of the motherboard, so we'll go ahead and bring the cable through the cutout and we're going to plug it in with the HD audio text facing up the way. We've got a system fan header here, so I'm going to bring the cable coming from our rear fan through and get it plugged in. We've got a PWM and ARGB header here, so I'm going to bring the cables coming from our fan hub through and we'll get them plugged in. We've got 2 USB 2.0 headers at the bottom of the motherboard, so we'll bring the USB 2.0 cable coming from our screen through and we'll get it plugged in with the USB text facing up the way. Our front panel connectors are going to go into this header at the bottom right hand side of the motherboard, so we're going to plug the cable in with the front panel text facing up the way. We've got 2 USB Type A 5GB/s ports on our motherboard, so we can bring the USB Type A cable from our case through, line it up with the headers and push into place. And we've got a right angle Type C connector on the motherboard here, so we'll bring our Type C cable through and push into place. I've gone ahead and plugged the cables into our power supply that we're going to need, so plugged in our 24-pin motherboard cable, 2 8-pin EPS cables to provide additional power to our CPU. I plugged in an 8-pin PCIe cable, and this is going to provide additional power to our PCIe slots. Most motherboards won't have this connector, so using a different motherboard you probably don't need to plug this in. I plugged in a SATA power cable because our ARGB and fan hub is going to need SATA power, and a 12-volt high power cable to power our graphics card. So just before we set our power supply into place, I'm going to bring our extension cable out through this cutout, and we can then slide our power supply into place with the fan facing down the way. We can then secure the power supply into place using 4 of the large power supply screws. So just before we plug our cable in, we're going to want to make sure we turn our power supply to on. For this particular orientation, I'm going to have to create a loop of cable and plug the cable into the power supply. And then I'm just going to push the excess cable through to the back. And then we can replace our mesh side panel. So you can see the reasoning behind this. We now have good access to our power supply, so if we needed to unplug or plug something in, we're able to see the connectors easily. So you could actually plug your cables in after you've installed your power supply if you wanted to. So our two 8-pin EPS cables are going to go into these headers at the top left of the motherboard. So we'll go ahead and bring the cables through the cutout at the top and get them plugged into the motherboard. And I can just tidy the cables up using the included cable combs. Our 24-pin cable is going to go into this header here, so we'll bring it through the rubber grommet, line the cable up with the header on the motherboard and push into place. And then we can just tidy up the cable using the included cable combs. Our motherboard's supplemental PCIe power cable is at the bottom, so we can bring our 8-pin PCIe cable through and get it plugged in. And we need to plug the SATA cable from our power supply into the SATA cable coming from our fan and RGB hub. We're now ready to start working our I/O, and the first thing we can do is set our fans down onto the radiator. Now one side of these fans is going to have cables showing, so you're going to want to have this side facing the back of the case. We can then secure the fans into place using the long radiator screws. We've got some plastic clips which will push into place covering all these screws. And we get this extension cable which we're going to plug in to the end. So taking a look at how the wiring is going to work, this extension cable is going to plug into a cable coming from our pump, which you're planning on using Phanteks' new Nextlink hub. You can plug this directly into the hub. I'm not planning on doing this, so we're going to use the adapter which comes with our I/O. And coming from that adapter, we've got a 4-pin PWM cable to go into our CPU fan header and a 3-pin 5V RGB cable to go into an RGB header on our motherboard. The only other cable coming from our pump is this 3-pin fan connector, and we'll plug that into our pump header on the motherboard. The only additional thing we need to do is change the Intel bracket for an AMD one, so we can simply push down to free the bracket up, and then we can slide our AMD bracket up and into place. If you get the I/O from new, it will come with thermal paste pre-applied. I've already used this I/O, which is why there's none here. Next we can set our top radiator bracket into place, and we'll secure it into place using the included short radiator screws. So just before we set our I/O into place, I'm going to bring the 4-pin PWM and RGB cables through and get them plugged into the motherboard. Then I'm just going to pass the cable coming from our fans through to the back of the case. We can line our I/O up at the top and lower it down. We'll secure it into place with the 2 screws we removed earlier on, and at this stage we can replace our case's top panel. If you get the I/O from new, it will come with thermal paste pre-applied. I've already used this I/O, so I'm going to add some additional thermal paste to the CPU. Next we can line the I/O up with the brackets we've already fixed to the motherboard, and then we've got a thumb screw to go on to each corner. And then we can go ahead and tighten each thumb screw up with a screwdriver in turn. Our pump header is right next to our CPU fan header, so we'll bring the 3-pin cable and get it plugged in. And then we'll just pass all the excess cable up and through to the back. Likewise, our larger cable we're going to pass through to the back as well. So just a few cables to connect up at the back, so we can take the cable coming from our fans and the radiator and plug it into the cable coming from our pump. And then the PWM and RGB adapter we've already plugged into the motherboard, we'll plug this cable into it. We're now ready to install our graphics card, and we're going to need to remove the 2nd and 3rd expansion slot cover from the top. Next we're going to have to open the slot, and rather than push it, there's a little button here that we can press to open it up. We can then go ahead and line the graphics card up with the slot, and once we're happy everything's lined up, it's just some firm pressure and the graphics card's going to clip into place. We'll secure the graphics card with the 2 thumb screws we removed earlier on, and then to close the slot we just need to push this button again. Next I'm just going to bring our 12V high power cable through the cutout at the bottom. We'll line it up with the graphics card and push into place, and then we'll just tidy up the cable using the included cable combs. Okay, last thing to do is some cable management and get the panels back on again. So you might have noticed that I swapped the RAM kit out. The reason for doing that was the Kingston Fury kit that I used when set to white was actually more of a yellow colour, and it was very different from all the other white lighting in the case. So you'll find a link to the final kit that I used in the video description. As you can notice, I've gone ahead and set the PC up off camera. If you don't know how to do that, I've made another video which covers all of that, and you'll find a link to that video in the description. The only thing it won't show you how to do is to set up the Antec iUnity software. But really all you need to do is head over to the Flux Pro webpage on Antec's site. You'll be able to download the software from there. You're simply going to install it and then the display will work on the side of the PC. You've got 4 options for the display, and simply pressing the temp button on the top of the PC cycles through the options of just displaying your CPU temperature, just displaying your GPU temperature, turning the display off, and displaying both CPU and GPU temperature. In terms of our temperatures, our Ryzen 7 9700X idled at 40 degrees and reached a maximum of 64 degrees during its 10-minute IDA64 stability test. The Strix RTX 4080 idled at 27 degrees and reached a maximum of 66 degrees during the stability test. In terms of noise, we had average noise levels of 36 decibels at idle and 47 decibels under load. So you guys were right, the Antec Flux Pro is an absolutely brilliant case, and I appreciate the recommendation to check it out. And if you are wanting to do a build in, hopefully you find the build guide helpful. I didn't think the case was perfect, and there was 3 things I would like to have seen changed in it. I did think it was a little bit bad that in a case that comes with 6 pre-installed case fans, that the fan hub only has 5 PWM connectors on it, so you were actually only able to plug 5 of the 6 included case fans into that hub. So while the 2 reverse blade fans beneath the graphics card did a great job of cooling our graphics card, aesthetically I didn't think they looked great centered towards the front of the case and leaving that rear fan mounting slot at the back unoccupied. I do think Antec, if they had included 3 fans at the bottom, the case would have looked much better. And the final thing that I wish Antec had included in this case would have been a GPU support bracket, particularly given how the case can support such large graphics cards. But apart from those 3 small points, the case is a really solid case, and I've really enjoyed putting the build together in it. If you have enjoyed this full step-by-step PC build guide, please remember to give it a thumbs up, and if you're not currently subscribed to the channel, please hit the subscribe button as well. Thanks for watching.